It's Cap Konami at its finest on Metroidvania Works 23.
Yippee-ki-yay, mother.
Metroidvania meets Ghosts and Goblins? Well, not exactly, but you can kind of see how Capcom was angling towards something in that direction with Gargoyle's Quest. An unlikely creation on multiple levels, Gargoyle's Quest demonstrates Capcom at the peak of their 8-bit form. The company made its entree into portable gaming on the shiny new Game Boy handheld here, and it's springboarded here by leaping off the shoulders of its cash cow, Ghosts and Goblins. Now, the company could simply have attempted to convert its Ghosts and Goblins series, which at the time was Capcom's most successful franchise, challenged only by an ascendant Mega Man, to Game Boy. Plenty of their contemporaries had taken a similar approach, as with Konami's Castlevania the Adventure, or TMNT, The Fall of the Foot Clan. Those games were generally pretty unpleasant to play, even if TMNT did have nice-looking graphics. But technically, yes, faithful ports from NES to Game Boy could exist. Thankfully, cooler heads prevailed, and accepted the fact that Ghosts and Goblins, a game about fast action, tiny projectiles, and split-second responses, would have made for a terrible experience on a small passive matrix LCD screen with poor visibility and crushing display lag. Surprisingly, it turns out that the creators of Ghosts and Goblins don't hate us. Rather than subjecting the world to the most miserable version of their game imaginable, they instead sat down and went back to the drawing board, rebuilding the series in the form of an action RPG. Fortunately, they didn't have to do this work from scratch. Back during the initial Famicom boom, Capcom's home team had fudged their assignment to convert pirate ship HIGEMARU from coin-op to console, and came up instead with HIGEMARU Makaijima, a crossover between HIGEMARU and Ghosts and Goblins that reimagined both of its component games as a sort of Zelda wannabe. Gargoyle's Quest builds on this precedent, but it drops the HIGEMARU elements and veers actively toward Ghosts and Goblins, shifting the bulk of the action back to side-scrolling and limiting the top-down stuff to world navigation and NPC interactions. Most of all, it dares to place players in the role of the series' most reviled monster, the dread Red Armor, that almost invariably represents the original game's first sticking point. Now, rather than trying to outwit, outmaneuver, and outfight an Armor, you simply are an Armor, a knight of the satanic realm named Firebrand. Of course, a video game like this would be no fun without any sort of friction or challenge, so Gargoyle's Quest confronts a question that no sensible person ever thought to ask. What kind of monsters could be so badass that they represent a threat to one of the deadliest and most horrible creatures in the video game pantheon? The answer turns out to be a great many, because just about every creature you encounter can wreck Firebrand if you're not careful. At least at first, anyway. Firebrand does not begin this adventure as the deadly, game-over-dealing force of hell you know from arcades or NES. Rather, he's a sluggish little guy who has pitiful attack power and range, can barely jump, and whose flight abilities limit him to hovering for a couple of seconds before plunging back to the ground. Shocking as it may be to see Arthur's nemesis reduced to an even less capable state than Arthur himself here, it works. Specifically, it works within the context of a Game Boy action game. Firebrand's limited mobility and reduced speed give players more time to spot and react to threats, despite the restrictive screen dimensions of the platform. And it neatly answers a question that no one had really had the opportunity to even ask at this point. How do you make a Metroidvania work on a portable system? Game Boy was barely a year old when Gargoyle's Quest launched in Japan, and the system's developers had barely gotten a handle on the logistics of reworking well-established genres like shooting and sports into portable form. And yet here's Gargoyle's Quest tackling the complexities of non-linear action driven by narrative and character growth on a platform where everyone else was simply struggling to make more straightforward game formats work without feeling overly compromised. Capcom arrived at a pretty savvy solution here, one that would become a defining trait of portable adventures in this vein until Nintendo Switch finally shattered the barrier between portable and console gaming more than 25 years later. Namely, it greatly streamlines and simplifies the genre. Sure, Gargoyle's Quest looks like a free-roaming adventure thanks to its top-down RPG framing, but in truth it really only offers a single path through the story. Each major phase of the adventure generally boils down to gathering clues and tips from NPCs, then venturing out through a string of random encounters in order to complete an instanced dungeon where you defeat a boss and collect an item or power that enables you to advance to the next sequence. To its credit, Gargoyle's Quest does an excellent job of obscuring this linearity to create an illusion of player agency. You can wander off the main path just enough to create the sensation of poking at the edges of the world. And as Firebrand grows in power, the action doubles back into earlier areas, just long enough to give you the opportunity to flex your new abilities and strength in order to reinforce the fact that no, it's not your imagination, you really are that much more powerful now. By organizing the quest into a progressive journey of easily digested pieces, Capcom creates a perfect handheld structure for a relatively long-term adventure. Each dungeon really only takes 10 or 15 minutes to complete, and you can easily return to the nearest town to save your progress as needed. Gargoyle's Quest doesn't contain an experience or stat system per se, so you don't really need to record your progress until you hit a major milestone of acquiring a new ability, weapon, or life upgrade. Which is to say that if you find your portable session suddenly interrupted and have to shut down the Game Boy before completing a dungeon, you don't really lose anything by not being able to save on the spot. Yet despite its simplified design, Gargoyle's Quest is anything but simplistic. As Firebrand's abilities grow, he gains skills that stand out as completely unique even today. Firebrand augments his flight powers with the ability to cling to surfaces, giving him a more precise and nuanced version of Strider Hiryu's triangle jump. This power factors into his skill enhancements and gives players reason not to simply treat the latest of Firebrand's attack upgrades as the de facto combat option. One of his mid-game attacks creates a temporary safe surface over spike-lined walls, meaning that you'll often need to downgrade his power from time to time in order to achieve better mobility in hazardous spaces. All of these factors combine to create a game that barely plays like the other entries in its parent franchises, yet which feels wholly faithful. Gargoyle's Quest demands the same precise control and willingness to endure repeated failures as Ghosts and Goblins, yet it never pushes too hard against the limitations of its portable platform. In that sense, it really does feel like a kindred spirit to HIGEMARU Makaijima. Where that game explored the optimal form for a Famicom adventure, Gargoyle's Quest experiments with the boundaries of another new gaming format. It's a stunning success in that regard, and again, the examples Capcom established here would become standards for future portable Metroidvanias. Look at the likes of Metroid II and Fusion, or the portable exploratory Castlevanias, or even landmark works in kindred genres like The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. Each of those games would take a different approach than their console kin, downsizing their worlds, breaking their quest into easily digestible chunks, and giving the player clearer guidance. Even if it doesn't entirely exemplify the traits we think of as Metroidvania, Gargoyle's Quest proved the platform action RPG can work even on a handheld system. And while a bit brief by modern standards, it's still thoroughly enjoyable even today, the ultimate sign of a great game. And we wrap this look at the evolution of action RPGs through the 1980s with the pinnacle of the era's design, Metal Gear II Solid Snake for MSX. Not to be mistaken for Snake's Revenge for NES, because honestly, how could you? No, we all know the story of how the success of Metal Gear on American NES eclipsed its performance on MSX and Famicom, inspiring Konami to create a samizdat follow-up called Snake's Revenge, which, while not terrible, didn't really capture the vibe of the original game. This in turn inspired Hideo Kojima to direct a proper sequel for MSX2 that improved on his previous work in almost every respect. Metal Gear 2 carries forward all of the key features of the original Metal Gear, including its overall action RPG vibe. It's Zelda with handguns. The sequel adopts a more linear structure, providing players with greater guidance by way of the radio. Narrative plays a much larger role in the game this time, with a massively expanded script that gives Solid Snake's radio contacts a larger, more active role in the adventure. At one point, one of them is even abducted, launching a subquest in which you need to seek out and rescue her. Metal Gear 2 also introduces in-world NPCs, who aren't enemy soldiers or captured allies, largely in the form of children who inexplicably wander the corridors of the military fortress that Snake infiltrates. Inexplicably, at least, and we see perhaps the first instance of Kojima as a writer attempting to grapple with geopolitics and the travails of war. It also flirts with his love of metatext, with an MSX cartridge manufactured by Konami playing a surprisingly significant role in the plot. Mechanically, Metal Gear's heavy emphasis on stealth and silent combat carry forward here, along with Snake's dual menu inventory system that divides out weapons and gear into separate categories. But everything that returns from the original incorporates new features to add greater depth. For example, stealth once again revolves around enemy line of sight and sound. But more things in the environment create noise that can give away your position. Loose flooring, sand, and more. Snake can avoid being loud by making use of his newly added ability to crawl, which causes him to move at a steadier pace and balances out his weight to avoid triggering noisy floors. Crawling has other benefits too. For example, crawling over a minefield allows you to safely deactivate the mines and add them to your inventory. And most importantly, crawling allows you to slip into narrow spaces, which opens up new stealth and exploration options. Crawling under a vehicle or into a vent lets you avoid being spotted in more elegant ways than playing hide and seek around corners. Slipping into these narrow spaces opens up the world in new ways, allowing you to take paths that wouldn't have existed before and moving outside of the enemy installation through service corridors, vents, and crawl spaces. The idea of incentivizing players to break the rigid boundaries of visible level design had been in play since at least 1985, when Super Mario Bros. Rewarded those who asked, "What happens if I jump over the top of the screen?" by giving them warp zones. And here the in-game character has to exploit this sort of logic, something that Metroid Fusion would do to great effect more than a decade later. The concept of active play space itself takes a level up in Metal Gear 2 thanks to the addition of a critical new game mechanic, the radar system. A small green box in the upper right corner, the radar effectively replaces the first game's cumbersome binocular mechanic. Metal Gear's binoculars allowed players to peek ahead one screen in any cardinal direction to get a sense of the surrounding geography and enemy locations, but this came at the cost of having to fumble through menus, rendering the action inert, while the binoculars remained in play. The radar offers the same benefits, but seamlessly. It presents players with an abstraction of surrounding rooms on a 3x3 grid, and simultaneously tracks Snake's position in the movement of enemies as small dots. Although Metal Gear 2 operates on the same screen-by-screen level design and movement as the original, a concession to the MSX2's meager scrolling capabilities, the addition of the radar indicator means that the actual active space at any given moment spans 9 screens. Enemies can move freely between spaces, and Snake's actions, such as creating noise and killing guards, maintains an element of persistence lacking in Metal Gear. Kill a guard and cross the edge transition back and forth into that screen again, and the dead foes no longer respawn, but instead remain out of action. Play Zanzibar Land's rousing patriotic anthem when you enter a room, and soldiers on adjacent screens will stand at attention. Stumble into a guard's line of sight, and the alert phase spans an entire zone, not just a screen, and all enemies will pass through multiple alert phases as they spread out and search for Snake. The original Metal Gear did this to a certain degree, but it always felt inconsistent and arbitrary. Here these phases obey more predictable rules. All of this results in a game world that feels larger and less video game-like than that of Metal Gear. And the radar's electronic nature leaves the door open for interesting gameplay twists. You'll occasionally find your radar taken out of action due to interference or the loss of your inventory, forcing you to rely on visual observation and stealth rather than by charting the current situation on the radar monitor. This consideration for gameplay systems and the workings of the world runs throughout Metal Gear 2. It manifests in small ways, like the need to wait for elevators to arrive at your current floor, which means you can't simply duck into an elevator to instantly escape the heat of an enemy patrol, but instead need to consider the timing of patrol movements versus that wait time when moving to new areas. The gas mask now has limited oxygen, creating a new consideration when in gas-flooded areas. Even things like language matter. The Czech scientist, Dr. Marv, doesn't speak English, which sends you off on yet another side quest. Metal Gear 2 feels more puzzle-like than its predecessor, though it has a more guided, linear structure. At this point, it's almost difficult to call Metal Gear 2 an action RPG despite its roots in the genre. With its fairly rigid narrative progression and lack of character experience, or an economy, it shares very little in common with what the genre had evolved to become by 1990. As seen in games like CRYSTALIS or Ys 3, which is not a knock on this game by any means. On the contrary, Metal Gear 2 is a masterpiece, with a design so good that Konami and Kojima would remake it almost verbatim 3 times, with Metal Gear Solid, Metal Gear Ghost Babel, and Metal Gear Solid 2. But just as the action RPG had diverged from the Metroidvania over time, Metal Gear 2 diverges from the action RPG to become the template for a genre that would become fairly dominant in the late 90s. A narrative-driven action game that offers players a moderate amount of freedom to explore and investigate in each moment-to-moment scenario, but whose overall structure and flow kept things pretty well defined according to the developer's story setup. In a way, that makes Metal Gear 2 a kindred spirit to the likes of Gargoyle's Quest, or even the Japanese console RPGs taking form around the same time. Menu-based commands and party mechanics aside, is there really that much dividing Metal Gear 2 and Final Fantasy IV? So I suppose you could say that this is an action RPG, just in terms that barely resemble where the genre began a decade earlier. That's evolution for you. And with this, the first phase of Metroidvania Works comes to an end. I've covered the first decade of game design evolution that would lead into the masterpieces that defined the genre in the 1990s and the indie revolution of the following decade. I'll be putting all of this material with new content and expanded revised text into a book tentatively to be called Metroidvania, the First Decade. Look for it sometime in probably 2024. But for now, it's time to jump back over to NES Works and say Gaiden. Don't worry though, Metroidvania Works will return, eventually.